The lobby of Whitmore Aviation Academy gleamed with polished marble floors and tall glass windows that threw sunlight across a wall of trophies. Emily crouched at the base of the display case, her gloved hands moving steadily over brass nameplates that listed decades of accolades. She could hear the sound of expensive shoes clicking across the floor, followed by the carefully modulated voice of Charles Whitmore approaching from behind. He spoke loudly, his words meant to carry. He gestured toward the investors clustered near him, then toward Emily without looking her way. "This is one of our veteran transition trainees, a former military pilot learning the basics of civilian aviation," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Emily kept her eyes on the glass. She heard someone murmur, "Oh, how wonderful," followed by a polite laugh that didn't match the awkward silence settling over the group. Charles took a step closer, his tone turning lighter as if he were entertaining guests at a cocktail party. "She claims to have flown combat missions. But around here, everyone starts from the bottom. Aircraft maintenance begins with knowing how to keep a trophy case spotless." The laughter this time was tighter, more uncertain. Emily's spine stayed straight. Her movements didn't pause. She felt the heat rising in her face but willed it back down like she'd done under fire, under pressure, under far worse. She saw her own face reflected in the glass. Calm, unreadable eyes, locked and steady. One of the executives cleared his throat and looked uncomfortable. Another avoided Emily's gaze entirely. Charles remained composed, a man in charge, a man performing his version of leadership for people who understood money, but not war. Emily finished the last corner of the glass, stood slowly, and peeled off her gloves with care. She didn't speak. Not yet. The silence around her did the work. It pressed in on everyone standing there. She tucked the gloves into her back pocket and looked directly at Charles just long enough for him to understand something he hadn't expected. He wasn't mocking a broken veteran. He was taunting a fighter who hadn't even started fighting yet. Part 1. Introducing Emily Sympathy Buildup. At 39, Emily Prescott wore her age with quiet resolve. She had the kind of presence that didn't ask for attention but drew it anyway, not from the way she looked but from the way she carried herself. Her clothes were plain, faded jeans, a cotton shirt rolled at the sleeves and boots, worn smooth at the heel, but nothing about her ever looked sloppy. She moved like someone who had been trained to assess risk without blinking. Years in a cockpit had taught her to measure everything from weather to silence. Her hair, always pulled into a tight bun, revealed a scar at her temple that no one dared to ask about, but everyone noticed. Emily had flown combat missions in Iraq and Syria, logged thousands of hours in aircraft that few civilians could name, and led teams through firestorms most people only saw on the news. Her call sign had been Hawkeye, a name earned not through arrogance but through precision. She was the one they sent in when things went wrong and needed someone who wouldn't flinch. But combat ended, and the politics began. She testified before Congress about faulty systems that put lives at risk. It was the right thing to do, but it cost her. The contract she exposed had ties to powerful names, including the Whitmore family, and the fallout buried her career in whispers and blocked opportunities. After leaving active duty, she declined the consulting jobs and the defense contractors who offered more money than purpose. Instead, she enrolled in a federal transition program designed to help veterans re-enter civilian life. It was supposed to be a bridge. Instead, it felt like a test of endurance. They placed her in custodial roles, entry-level assignments, a series of silent tasks that required no mind and even less pride. But Emily never complained. She knew something that others didn't, that quiet work builds focus and humility sharpens character. She didn't see these jobs as beneath her. She saw them as a runway. Every morning she got up early, made her own coffee, and ran 2 miles before sunrise. Her truck was old but dependable, and her apartment was small but clean, decorated with flight patches and one photo of her father, also a pilot. She didn't talk much about her service unless asked. Most people didn't ask. They saw the janitor badge and assumed the story ended there. That was fine with her. She wasn't interested in correcting assumptions. She was waiting for the right moment to show them. Her strength wasn't loud. It came in the form of patience, composure, and the ability to keep showing up even when the world tried to erase her value. She knew who she was even when no one else did, and that made her dangerous in all the ways people like Charles Whitmore never saw coming. Part 2. The elite environment. Setting the stage. Whitmore Aviation Academy sat like a sculpture in the Nevada desert, all steel lines and reflective glass. The campus buildings were sleek, designed to impress with minimalist architecture and manicured walkways that made it feel more like a tech company than a flight school. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of expensive cologne and lemon polish, and every surface gleamed under recessed lighting. Everything about the place said prestige. Students walked the halls in pressed uniforms, their name tags engraved, not printed. Most came from families who had private planes before they could drive cars. The dining area served almond milk lattes and quinoa wraps. The locker rooms had full-length mirrors and discreet speakers playing soft jazz. Even the hangars were spotless, the concrete floors buffed to a shine that reflected the underside of the aircraft like water. Emily stood out the second she walked in, not just for her worn boots and off-the-rack jacket, but because she moved differently. She didn't pause to admire the trophies. She didn't shrink around the administrators. She simply kept her head down and did the work even when no one noticed. When she first entered the cafeteria, a student with perfect teeth and a private pilot's license asked if she was part of the janitorial staff. She smiled and nodded without correcting him. Another time, she overheard two instructors debating whether she had really flown jets or just worked ground crew. No one ever asked her directly. The assumptions floated through the air, quiet but sharp like the hum of the overhead lights. Her ID badge listed her as a participant in the Whitmore Veteran Initiative, which most people saw as charity, not strategy. She attended every safety briefing and logged every cleaning duty without pushback. Yet, when simulator time was handed out, her name was always last. Sometimes it didn't even appear on the list. She never argued. She took notes on everything. The staff addressed her with a practiced friendliness that didn't go beneath the surface. They smiled like they were checking a box, not starting a conversation. She wasn't one of them. She wasn't supposed to be. But every time she walked past the training aircraft, her fingers twitched like they remembered controls. Every time a jet roared overhead, she looked up with the kind of hunger no course catalog could describe. And every night alone in her room, she studied aircraft schematics, like someone preparing for a mission they hadn't been cleared for yet. Part 3. The public shaming conflict rising. Subpart 3.1, Spotlight of Disrespect. Emily had just begun wiping the last shelf when she heard the glass doors swing open behind her. Charles's voice followed a beat later, warm and loud, the kind of tone used by someone who wanted everyone to look his way. The rhythm of his shoes on the floor was confident, followed by a softer chorus of leather soles and polished heels. Investors, most of them older, all of them dressed like their time was expensive. He waved toward the display case like a tour guide, pausing just long enough to gesture toward Emily without saying her name. This is one of our program participants from the Veteran Initiative. She comes to us with what she calls combat experience. It was a joke disguised as praise, and it worked. A few chuckles passed through the group like a breeze that made everyone uncomfortable, but not enough to speak. Emily kept her hand moving slowly along the edge of the shelf. Her eyes never left the glass. Her pulse thudded once in her neck, then settled. She had trained herself to absorb pressure in silence. She'd done it in flight briefings. She could do it now. Charles took another step closer. His smile thinned. We start everyone at the beginning here, no matter what they've claimed before. In her case, that means learning how to properly clean and inspect equipment before handling it. Of course, we've had to make some adjustments to her schedule. Certain behavioral patterns weren't quite aligned with civilian aviation standards. Emily blinked once. That was the line. Not an outright accusation, just enough to imply instability. Enough to plant questions in the room without offering proof. One man, slightly balding and wearing a Pacific Airlines pin, shifted his weight. He glanced at Emily, then looked quickly away. Another cleared his throat but said nothing. The silence that followed was thick with politeness. No one wanted to challenge Charles. He sounded reasonable. Reasonable is hard to argue against in a room built on deals and reputations. Emily stood. She turned slowly, gloves still in hand, and locked eyes with Charles for the first time since he'd begun talking. Her expression didn't change. She didn't smile or frown. She simply stared, holding him in that quiet way that makes people squirm more than shouting ever could. She saw the flicker in his face just for a second. He hadn't expected resistance. Not this kind. Not stillness used as a weapon. And for the first time, the room around him didn't quite feel like his. Subpart 3.2, the clapback. Emily's voice came quiet, but every word landed like stone dropped into still water. I think real leadership isn't something you describe. It's something you live. And anyone who builds their reputation by cutting others down has already told you everything you need to know about who they are. The room went still again. The man from Pacific Airlines straightened slightly now, watching her with a kind of curiosity that hadn't been there before. Charles's smile faltered. Not gone, but uncertain now, like someone fumbling for a script that had gone missing. She stepped away from the case, wiping her palms on her pants without breaking eye contact. You mentioned behavioral concerns. That's interesting. I'd love to see those evaluations you referenced, considering they don't exist. Charles opened his mouth, then closed it again. Emily pulled out her phone and opened a file. These are my training logs. They show exactly what I've done here. They also show a pattern of being removed from sessions without explanation. While my classmates fly, I scrub floors. That's not transition. That's something else. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She just stated the facts slowly, clearly, and with a calm that made it hard to dismiss her as unstable or emotional. And for those wondering about my background, I flew 47 combat missions. I was never grounded for behavior, never disciplined, never failed a psychological review. You can verify all of that through the Department of Defense. My call sign was Hawkeye. Look it up. No one laughed now. Charles shifted uncomfortably, then tried to chuckle, playing it off. Perhaps this isn't the time or place for... It's exactly the time and place. You brought them here. You brought me into this moment. You used me to decorate your narrative. So let's finish the story right. She looked around the room once, then turned back to Charles and said, You thought I'd be too quiet to fight back. You thought wrong. She left the gloves on the display case still damp from glass polish. They looked harmless, but today they were the soft armor of someone who had just started to go to war. Part 4. The Shift, From Silence to Strategy. Subpart 4.1, Phone Calls and Allies. The lobby confrontation didn't leave Emily shaken. It left her certain. When she stepped outside into the sharp Nevada sunlight, she already knew what her next move had to be. She waited until she reached her truck before pulling out her phone. The first call was to Colonel Marcus Thompson, her former squadron commander now working as a defense consultant. His voice came on warm, surprised, and sharp with interest when she gave the short version of what was happening at Whitmore. They spoke for 15 minutes. By the end of it, Marcus's tone had shifted to business. He remembered the Whitmore contracts she testified against. He also remembered how careful she had always been with facts, not feelings. The next call went to Angela Martinez, a former military attorney who had once guided Emily through an investigation no one else wanted to touch. She asked 2 questions, then told Emily to start documenting everything and promised to reach out to someone at the FAA who specialized in training audits. Last was Derek Rodriguez, a test pilot she hadn't seen in years, but who once said she saved his life during a Syrian extraction gone wrong. He didn't hesitate when she asked for help. He only asked when. Each call felt like loading one more round into a chamber she hadn't realized was empty. By dusk, she had 3 allies. 3 people who didn't need convincing. 3 people who knew her record before Charles tried to rewrite it. She sat in her truck a long time after the last call. The desert was quiet. Her hands rested on the wheel fingers steady. The war hadn't started that day in the lobby. It had started years ago. But now she was ready to fight it on her terms. Subpart 4.2, The First Evidence. Emily had been assigned to clean out a storage room near the Academy's maintenance hangar. It was the kind of space no one monitored, filled with dusty boxes and unsorted binders. She wore gloves not just for hygiene, but because paper that old splinters in silence. Inside one binder, she found a set of flight maintenance logs. At first, they looked routine, but then she noticed inspection intervals listed at 300 hours. Federal guidelines capped them at 100. She flipped through the next set. Engine overhauls were marked as completed, yet no matching work orders or invoices existed. One aircraft had flown 72 hours past its documented certification. Another had a handwritten note marked void, beside a repair that was logged but never done. Emily sat down on a metal stool, documents in her lap, heart slow but heavy. This wasn't about her anymore. These weren't just lies told to humiliate a veteran. These were risks that could get people killed. She photographed every page. She cataloged each serial number. She organized the evidence the way she'd planned missions, by threat, by priority, by urgency. Then she locked the originals back in the box and returned them exactly where she found them. That night she wrote a report. She included everything she had gathered, from forged certifications to skipped inspections. When she finished, she stared at the screen for a long moment before saving the file. Exposing this would destroy the academy. It might damage the careers of people who had nothing to do with the cover-up, but staying silent would make her complicit in something far worse. She knew what it felt like to fly an aircraft into danger. She also knew what it meant to walk into it with open eyes. This wasn't sabotage. It was accountability, and Emily was ready to hold the line. Part 5. The battle begins. Twist rising. Subpart 5.1, the inspection. The sound of helicopters came first. Low, steady, official. By the time the first FAA van rolled through the academy gates, instructors had already started whispering to each other. 3 inspection teams fanned out across the campus, all in uniform, clipboards in hand. They moved fast, bypassing the administrative offices and heading straight for the hangars. No explanations, just directives and badges and seals that marked aircraft as grounded. Students clustered near the flight line, confused and wide-eyed. One girl asked if it was just a drill. An instructor told her to go back to class, but his voice shook, betraying the script. Charles appeared 10 minutes later, tie-loose, expression tight. He tried charm, first shaking hands, offering coffee, making small talk with the lead inspector. It didn't work. Lisa Park was focused, methodical, and already directing teams to specific aircraft listed in the report Emily had provided. They opened logbooks, matched them against maintenance histories, then pulled parts of the planes apart on site. It was clear they weren't just here to check boxes. They were here to catch something. Emily stayed back, watching from the edge of a service building. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The weight of what was happening had already shifted. Charles no longer controlled the room. He followed Lisa Park from hangar to hangar, his voice rising in volume and desperation. He called the inspection excessive. He hinted at political motives. He tried to position himself as a victim. But the seal tags kept going up. Bright red, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. And with everyone placed, the silence around the students grew thicker. It was no longer just a rumor. It was real. The academy was under investigation, and no speech from Charles could change what the evidence was beginning to reveal. Subpart 5.2, the smear campaign. Charles struck back the only way he knew how. Not in court, not in the hangars, but through reputation. By the next morning, industry newsletters were circulating a new version of the story. A troubled veteran with a complex history had infiltrated a respected flight program and used her access to manipulate data and create false accusations. No names were used, but it was clear who they meant. Podcasts that covered aviation trends invited Charles for interviews. He spoke about mental health challenges among veterans, framed his statements with concern, and questioned the reliability of unverified military records. He never called Emily unstable. He just let the audience wonder. He contacted military peers, asked pointed questions wrapped in concern. Had she always been this aggressive? Had there ever been issues with her behavior during deployment? Some didn't respond. Some gave neutral answers, but others worried for their own reputations. Let the silence stretch into suggestion. Emily started receiving fewer callbacks. Inquiries about new jobs went unanswered. A few instructors she had spoken to at the academy stopped returning texts. Jessica, one of the younger students, told her people were saying she was part of a takedown operation, that she had targeted Whitmore from the start. Emily knew what it was, a slow, steady poison, not strong enough to kill outright, just enough to isolate, discredit, and undo everything one whisper at a time. She didn't panic, but she felt the walls tightening. She had fought battles with missiles and radar. This one came dressed in polite words and careful pauses, and in some ways it was more dangerous, because the wounds it left didn't bleed. They just erased. Part 6. The Sky Strike. The Grand Twist. Subpart 6.1 The Ceremony Trap. The courtyard was dressed in red, white, and gold. Rows of folding chairs faced a polished podium flanked by academy banners and framed photos of smiling cadets. A jazz quartet played softly as guests arrived in linen suits and sunglasses, clutching donation cards and programs that listed Charles Whitmore as the guest of honor. Charles stood off to the side, adjusting his cuffs and checking the time. He looked relaxed, confident the way only someone surrounded by wealth and power could look. He thanked donors by name and nodded to camera crews already setting up near the front. He took the stage with a slow smile and a speech that sounded practiced. He spoke of sacrifice, of mentorship, of building futures. He nodded toward the clouds as if the sky itself had blessed his vision. He called the academy a beacon, a bridge for veterans, a legacy. That was when the sound arrived. Low at first, then rising. A sharp-cut jet engine slicing clean through the music. People turned their heads. Phones lifted. Even Charles paused mid-sentence. Over the rooftop came a fighter jet in a steep arc, sunlight bouncing off its wings. The paint shimmered in navy blue and silver. A second pass followed slower this time. And trailing behind it, smoke lines drew the names of 6 female pilots long forgotten by the public but carved into Emily's memory. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some applauded, unsure. Others just stared. Then came the third pass, and from the belly of the aircraft a small black box dropped with a silver parachute floating straight down and landing at Charles's feet. The music stopped. The speeches froze. Charles looked down at the box, then up at the plane disappearing into the sky. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The moment had flipped. What was meant to be his crowning hour now belonged to someone else. Subpart 6.2 The Sky Speaks Truth. The screen lit up behind the stage. No announcement. No one said a word. The video played on its own. First came the cockpit view. Emily's voice calmly calling coordinates, her jet banking hard under fire, navigating a rescue in conditions most pilots wouldn't have attempted. Then the side-by-side clips began. Safety violations at Whitmore. Overdue logs. Footage of Charles waving off inspections. Side audio of him mocking veterans. The truth didn't need an introduction. It stood tall in silence. The audience didn't move. Some sat with hands frozen mid-clap. Others lowered their phones. A few looked directly at Charles, now visibly sweating, his jaw tight, his eyes darting toward the exit but held in place by the weight of what had just unfolded. From the back row, Emily walked forward. No uniform, no speech, just boots on concrete, steady, slow, grounded. She didn't look at Charles. She didn't need to. She walked to the black box, picked it up, and turned it over in her hand. Then she set it on the podium and stepped aside, her message complete. The crowd began to shift, not with cheers, but with something quieter, a reckoning. No one needed to say who was right anymore. The sky had spoken for her. And Emily, as always, had let her actions do the work. She walked away without waiting for applause. Justice had never been about applause. It had always been about truth. And truth, once seen, could not be unseen. Part 7. The Aftermath. Emotional Resolution. The Academy closed its doors 3 weeks after the ceremony. The FAA issued a full suspension of operations pending a federal investigation. Charles was named in multiple reports, not as a direct saboteur, but as someone who had knowingly overlooked systemic failures for personal gain. The board of directors dissolved quietly. Donations dried up. What had once been marketed as a model of innovation became a case study in negligence. Emily didn't watch the coverage. She didn't need to. She had already seen enough behind the curtain. The legal process stretched into months. Angela handled most of it, with Emily sitting through only the critical meetings. The Department of Defense confirmed her combat record. The media, slow to retract their earlier spin, eventually shifted tone. Interviews were offered. She turned them down. Derek moved to a private contractor role in Arizona. He sent Emily a flight patch from his new team with a note that just said, "Still here. Still flying." Marcus retired quietly, proud, never needing credit. He called Emily once in a while just to check in. Emily moved north. A job opened with the Mountain Rescue Service in Utah. Low pay, high risk, no press. It was exactly what she wanted. She flew solo shifts along snowy ridges and narrow valleys, lifting out hikers who had misread weather or time. The work felt clean, honest. The house she rented was small, one floor quiet tucked between pine trees with a creek behind it. She drove a forest green truck that rattled on the uphill but never failed. Her neighbors waved. They didn't ask questions. At night she read. She kept a box of old flight logs in her closet and sometimes opened them just to run her fingers over the ink. Her father's photograph stayed on the bookshelf next to a compass she once carried on every deployment. She didn't frame the headlines. She didn't keep the articles. But she did print a single photo from the day of the ceremony. The sky split by smoke trails. 6 names. 1 woman walking forward. She knew justice had come with a cost. She'd lost time, trust, and pieces of herself that couldn't be reclaimed. But what remained was enough. It was built from truth. And truth, she'd learned, was the only thing that could fly without fear. Some nights after a long shift, Emily sat outside with a cup of coffee and looked at the stars. They reminded her of missions flown at night, of silence broken only by the hum of instruments and the voice of a wingman in her ear. But more than anything, they reminded her of what her father used to say, that the sky doesn't care who you are, only how you fly. She thought about that during hard moments, when her name was dragged through headlines, when people whispered instead of asking, when truth felt like a weak defense against well-funded lies, but his words stayed with her steady as a heading in heavy wind. It's not about the noise. It's about the line you hold when no one sees you. It's about how you show up, how you stay solid in a world built on distractions and spin, and how you keep going when your voice shakes, but your purpose doesn't. She never wanted revenge, only truth, only fairness. She knew there were others out there like her, quiet, steady, carrying more than they ever told. People who had been doubted, dismissed, or told they were too broken to lead. Her story was never just about a jet or a school. It was about showing that silence isn't weakness. That kindness can still cut through steel. Emily didn't need to speak loudly. She had flown through storms. She had stood her ground in rooms that tried to shrink her. And now, she flew again. Not for medals, not for recognition, but because she still believed in pulling people out of danger and bringing them home when they lost their way. She hoped someone out there would hear her story and find their own strength in it. Because the truth is, even when the world tries to write you off, your next chapter is still yours to write. And sometimes the simplest life, the quiet, steady, honest one, is the boldest flight path of all.